jacket on the seat beside him. Navy blue. CTA regulation issue. Folded the way you fold something you intend to use but have not needed yet, which is to say folded carefully with the kind of attention that means it matters. It has been there every shift for 6 years. Every morning route and every evening route and every double he picked up when someone called out sick and the dispatcher needed a body behind a wheel. 6 years of Chicago winters and summers in the long gray Aprils that refused to commit to either. 6 years of Route 63, southbound through Woodlawn and Inglewood, in the neighborhoods where the city's attention arrived late, if it arrived at all. The jacket has never been used. It sits on the seat the way some people keep a photograph in a wallet, not to show anyone, just to know it is there. Cedric Holloway does not explain the jacket. He does not explain most things he does. He learned a long time ago that the things worth doing rarely need explaining, and the things that need explaining are usually not worth doing. He is 34 years old. He has been driving this route for 6 years. He knows it the way a man knows a street he grew up on, not by the street signs, but by the specific quality of light in the afternoon and the smell of the air near the liquor store on 63rd, and the way the bus tilts slightly to the left at the intersection near Ashland, because the road has been patched and repatched so many times that it has forgotten its original shape. He knows the people not by name but by pattern. The old woman who boards at Halstead every Tuesday and Thursday at 7:10, always the same stop, always the same small bag held against her chest with both arms. She is going to dialysis. He has never asked. She has never told him. There is an understanding between them that exists entirely in the space between a nod and a door that opens on time. The young man who boards at 63rd and Ashland 5 nights a week at 9:45, night shift at the warehouse in Pullman. Always tired, always polite, always wearing headphones with a cord that is not plugged into anything, because sometimes silence is the only privacy a person can afford on a city bus, and Cedric understands that. And there is the girl, the pregnant girl who boards every Friday at 55th in Halstead. She carries a clear plastic bag from what looks like a clinic. She sits near the front, close to the heater vent, and puts one hand on her stomach and watches the city move past the window. Not casually, attentively. The way you watch something you are trying to memorize before it changes. She does not know she is trying to memorize it. She does not know much about what she is doing. She is 23 years old and 7 months along, and she is doing the only thing available to her, which is to keep going. Her name is Amani. He does not know that yet. Before any of this, before the jacket and the route and the girl at the bus stop, there was a winter evening in East St. Louis when Cedric was 7 years old. His after-school tutor dropped him at the bus stop on Martin Luther King Drive at 4:15. The bus was scheduled for 4:30. It did not come at 4:30. It did not come at 5. The snow started at 5:12. He knew the exact time because there was a clock on the face of the bank across the street, and when you have nothing to do but wait and the thing you are waiting for has stopped, being a certainty, you watch the nearest clock the way a sailor watches the horizon. Cars passed. Not many. The few that did had their wipers going and their windows sealed and their headlights cutting through the falling snow in a way that made the snow look as if it were moving sideways. Each one swept its light across him and kept going. He was 7 years old. He was standing at a bus stop in a city that did not stop. There is a feeling that is worse than invisibility. Invisibility means no one can see you. What Cedric felt that evening was different. He could see the drivers see him. A brief shift in attention, a fraction of a second, when a face behind glass turned in his direction and registered his presence, and then made a decision. The decision was always the same. Not my problem. Not my stop. He would carry that specific feeling for 27 years without knowing exactly what to call it. Visible and ignored. Seen and passed over. It is not the same as loneliness, and it is not the same as fear. It is its own particular thing. And once you know what it feels like, you recognize it everywhere. In hospital waiting rooms, in the back half of a city bus, in the face of a pregnant woman standing in the snow on a February evening with not enough money on her fare card. The woman came at 6:21. He had been standing there for 2 hours and 6 minutes. She drove a sedan the color of rust. She pulled over without being flagged down, leaned across the passenger seat, and opened the door from the inside. She was wearing a dark blue coat. She did not ask his name. She did not ask why he was alone, or where his parents were, or whether he was supposed to be there. She looked at him standing in the snow with his backpack and his thin jacket, and she said 3 words. You looked cold. He got in the car. She drove him home. She did not say much else, and neither did he. She stopped in front of his house, and he got out, and she drove away, and he never learned her name. Lorraine was at the door before he reached the porch steps. She had gotten home 11 minutes earlier, had called the tutor and the school and the bus line, and was standing in the doorway with the phone still pressed against her palm, and on her face was an expression that he would not be able to describe accurately until he was much older. It was not panic. It was the face of a woman who had already lost one person from this house and could not survive losing another. She pulled him inside. She held him against her coat. She did not speak for a long time. Then she said she was sorry. Then she said it again. He told her it was okay. It was not okay. But he was 7 years old, and the person holding him was shaking, and that was what you said when you were 7, and the person holding you needed you to say it. His father's name was Roland. Roland had left when Cedric was 4. He did not leave dramatically the way leaving is sometimes dramatized in stories. He simply stopped coming home one winter, and by spring, the closet where his coats had hung was just a closet. Cedric did not remember the leaving. He remembered the closet, the empty hangers, the particular silence of a space that used to hold someone and no longer did. Lorraine never explained where Roland went. The explanation was already there in the empty closet, in the extra shifts, in the way she started locking the front door with both locks instead of one. Some explanations do not need words. They are written in the objects people leave behind and the habits people form around the spaces those objects used to occupy. Lorraine Holloway worked the night shift at the Tyson Foods processing plant in East St. Louis for 19 years. 10 at night to 6 in the morning, 5 days a week, sometimes 6. She would get home in time to make breakfast for Cedric and his younger sister Nyla before they left for school, eggs and toast if there were eggs, oatmeal if there were not. Then she would sleep for 4 hours, sometimes 3, and wake up and do whatever the house needed before doing it all again. She had been doing this long enough that her body had stopped protesting and had simply rearranged itself around the schedule the way a tree grows around a fence post. Not gracefully, just eventually. Her hands told the story her mouth never did. They were thick in the knuckles and rough across the palms, and they smelled faintly of industrial soap no matter how many times she washed them at home. The cold from the plant floor had settled into her joints permanently by the time she was 40. She opened and closed her fingers in the morning like someone testing a machine that used to work smoothly and now required negotiation. She never complained about the hands. She never complained about much of anything, not because she did not feel it, because complaining required an audience and energy, and she had neither to spare. What Lorraine had was a system. The system was simple. You got up, you went, you came home, you fed your children, you went again. The system did not require motivation or inspiration or someone telling you that you were doing a good job. The system only required that you showed up, which she did every night for 19 years in the kind of quiet relentlessness that nobody writes about because it is not dramatic enough to be a story. Except that it is the whole story. Lorraine did not teach her children with words. She taught with behavior. When Mrs. Dolores Parker, 3 houses down, had pneumonia and could not get out of bed, Lorraine made soup at 9:30 at night before her shift and carried it over in a pot. When a new family moved onto the block with boxes still unpacked in the yard, Lorraine was the one who knocked first, not with food because she did not have extra food, but with information. Which bus to take to the clinic? Which church gave out winter coats in November? Where the cheaper laundromat was? She gave what she had. What she had was knowledge of how to survive a place that was not designed to make survival easy. She did not do these things because she had read something about kindness or because someone had told her it was important. She did them because that was simply what you did when someone needed something and you were the person standing closest. Cedric watched. He watched her carry the soup pot across the street in the dark. He watched her knock on doors. He watched her sit with people in their kitchens when they were having a hard time not saying much, just being there, which he would later understand was the harder thing. Talking is easy. Staying is the thing that costs you something. He learned what a man was supposed to be not from watching one, but from the specific shape of the space where one should have been standing. His father had left a hole, His mother had filled it not with a replacement, but with herself, with the soup pot and the night shift and the sentence that lived in the walls. That same evening, after the soup she made, and the bath she ran, and the light she checked twice before she turned it off, Lorraine sat on the edge of his bed and said something she would say many more times over the years that followed. She said it the way some people say grace before a meal, not as a performance, but as a fact, as the floor the whole house was built on. You do not have to fix everything, she said. You just have to not walk past. He was 7 years old. He did not understand what that meant. But he heard it, and in the hearing lodge somewhere below the level of understanding, in the part of the body that learns before the mind does, in the way that cold teaches you what shelter is before anyone has to define either word. He heard it so many times over the years that he stopped hearing it as a sentence and started hearing it as his mother's voice. The two became the same thing, the words and the woman. Identical. He moved to Chicago when he was 28. He spent 6 years after high school doing the work that was available, warehouse shifts and temp contracts, and an 11-month stretch driving for a linen company that closed on a Tuesday without informing anyone until Wednesday. He applied for the Chicago Transit Authority because it was steady and had benefits, and because driving was the one skill he had always possessed without being able to explain why. Not fast driving, not flashy, just attentive. The kind of driver who checked mirrors more often than most people check their phones. He passed the training. He was assigned Route 63 southbound. He put the jacket on the seat beside him on his first day and never moved it. Nobody asked about it. He never explained it. The route ran through Woodlawn and Englewood and into the neighborhoods on the south side where the city's investment had been deferred so long that the deferral had become a kind of policy. The bus stops along Route 63 did not look like the bus stops along Michigan Avenue. On Michigan Avenue, there were shelters with glass panels and real-time arrival displays that told you the bus was 4 minutes away, and you could believe it. On Route 63, there were poles. Sometimes a sign. The average wait on the north side was 12 minutes. On Cedric's route, it was 28. Not because fewer buses were scheduled, because the buses that were scheduled broke down more often and got pulled from service more often and were replaced more slowly because the maintenance budget followed the same geography as everything else in the city. The money went where the money always went. Route 63 was the kind of route that drivers with seniority traded away the moment they had enough years to request a transfer. Cedric had enough seniority now. He had been offered a transfer twice. He stayed both times. The reason was not complicated. The people on this route needed a bus that showed up. Cedric was the kind of person who showed up. He knew them not by name but by pattern. He knew the rhythms of their Tuesdays and Thursdays and Friday afternoons. He knew which stops required the extra 2 seconds because someone was coming from the far end of the sidewalk and would not make it unless you waited, and he waited. Not as a performance of kindness, but as the natural behavior of a man who understood that his function in these people's lives was the reliable arrival of a door that opened. The jacket had been on the seat for 6 years. He did not think about it the way you think about something placed deliberately in a symbolic location. He thought about it the way you think about something that belongs where it is and therefore stops requiring thought. It was there. It would continue to be there. When it was needed, it would be used. This was not a plan. It was a fact he had not stated aloud. Imani Rochelle Webb grew up 8 miles south of where Cedric drove. Roseland, a neighborhood on the far south side that had over the decades absorbed every variety of institutional abandonment that a city can offer. In 2020, Roseland Community Hospital closed its doors. Not a merger, not a transition, a closure. The emergency room, the labor ward, the outpatient clinics, all of it. Gone in the time it takes a city to conclude that a neighborhood does not generate sufficient revenue to justify the cost of keeping its people alive nearby. Imani's mother, Denise Webb, had been an emergency room nurse at Roseland for 11 years. She was the kind of nurse who remembered patients by name and condition rather than chart number, who stayed past the end of her shift, not because she was required to, but because the person in the bed was not done needing her yet. When the hospital closed, Denise transferred to a facility 35 minutes away by car. She did not miss a shift. That was the Webb way. You went. Imani had decided at 16 that she would work labor and delivery. She had watched her mother come home from doubles with blood on her scrubs and something on her face that was not exhaustion, but was closer to purpose. The kind of tired that meant you had done something that mattered. She wanted that tired. She enrolled at Malcolm X College. She was in her final year when Terrence left. Terrence had said the right things for 7 months. He had shown up to appointments, had looked at the ultrasound images with an expression that appeared to be wonder, had made plans in the way that people make plans when plans feel theoretical. Then the second ultrasound confirmed it was a girl and something shifted in Terrence. The calls grew shorter. The replies came slower. The plans became vaguer until one evening he sat across from her at the kitchen table and said something that was not cruel but was honest in the way that certain honest things cause damage that cruelty never could. He said, "I cannot do this. I am not built for this." Imani looked at him across the table. She did not raise her voice. She asked one question. "Are you sure?" He said yes. She nodded. She watched him stand up. She watched him put on his coat. She watched the door close behind him. She did not chase him. The easier version of his life did not include a daughter and the woman carrying her, and the easier version had won. She sat at the table for a long time after he left. Then she called her mother. Denise answered on the first ring. Imani had grown up knowing two things about the world with certainty. The first was that the people who needed care most were often the furthest from the places that provided it. The second was that the distance between those 2 points was rarely an accident. She had learned the first thing from watching Roslyn fill up over the years, with people from Roseland and Pullman and Riverdale who had nowhere else to go, who came by bus and on foot and in cars that barely ran, who waited in the emergency room for hours, not because the staff did not care, but because the staff was overwhelmed and the funding was inadequate. She had learned the second thing the year Roslyn closed. Denise came home from her last shift at Roslyn in April with her ID badge in her hand and a look on her face that Imani had not seen before. Not grief exactly, something colder than grief. The specific expression of a person who has been told through the mechanism of an institution's closure that the work they have been doing for 11 years was not sufficiently valuable to continue. Denise put the badge on the kitchen counter. She said she would be at St. Bernard's starting Monday. She said 35 minutes each way. She said it without complaint, which was not the same as saying it without weight. Imani was 17 years old. She was watching her mother stand in the kitchen with an ID badge that no longer opened any doors, in a commute that had just added an hour and 10 minutes to every workday, and she understood with the particular clarity that 17-year-olds sometimes have about the things that will define them, that she was going to be a nurse, and that the problem her mother was standing inside of was going to be her problem too. She had not known in that kitchen in April of 2020 how specifically that would be true. She kept a photograph in her wallet. Not a photograph exactly. An ultrasound image from the 8-week appointment. The image showed almost nothing. A gray field with a small white dot at its center, circled with a marker, by the technician labeled with a small arrow. It did not look like a person. It did not look like anything recognizable. She kept it because it was the first proof, the first evidence that something was there, even when everything around her was structured to suggest she was managing this alone. She had folded it so many times that a white crease ran through the center of the image, splitting the small dot almost in half. She did not take it out often. She just kept it. The way you keep a promise in a place where you can feel its weight without needing to look at it. The morning of February 14th began the way most mornings began. Imani took the first bus from Roseland at 6:40, transferred twice, arrived at the clinic on the near north side at 8:15 for her prenatal appointment. The doctor said the baby was healthy, growing on schedule, strong heartbeat. Imani walked out into the February afternoon with the results in her plastic clinic bag and something in her chest she had not felt in weeks. Something close to the belief that things were going to work out. She boarded the bus at 55th and Halstead at 4:47. The bus was already 4 minutes behind schedule. It had been snowing since 3, and the roads were getting worse, and Gerald Pitts had already made 2 unscheduled stops due to a reroute near Garfield Boulevard, and each one had settled on his chest like a weight. Gerald Pitts was 52 years old. He had been driving for the Chicago Transit Authority for 14 years. He had, over the course of those 14 years, built his entire professional identity around a single fact: he ran on time. It was not a small thing to him. It was the only thing. Running on time was the evidence that the world could be held to a standard, that a schedule meant something, that numbers were reliable in a way that people often were not. He did not see the passengers on Route 63 as people the way Cedric saw them. He saw a schedule. He saw the clock on the dashboard and the distance between where he was and where he was supposed to be. Everything else was noise. Imani reached the fare box. She tapped her Ventra card. The reader beeped. The screen showed the balance 75 cents short. She looked at the screen. She looked in her bag. She found a quarter and 2 dimes in her coat pocket and held them toward the reader as if they might be enough if presented at the right angle. They were not enough. Gerald looked at the fare box. He looked at the clock. He did not look at her stomach. He did not look at the SO building against the windows. He said what he had been trained to say. The fare is $2. If you do not have the full fare, I cannot let you ride. Imani stood in the doorway with the clinic bag on her wrist and the coins in her palm, and the cold coming in from behind her. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Gerald and she said, I am 75 cents short. I just need to get home. Gerald said he understood, but he could not override the system. She looked past him at the passengers. The bus was half full. The woman in the 3rd row had been watching since Imani boarded. She had seen the card fail. She had seen the coins. She had made a decision in the first 2 seconds that this was not her scene, and she tapped her phone screen to keep it from going dark. The man in the gray coat was in the 4th row. 20 minutes earlier, at a stop further north, he had stood up without being asked and offered Imani his seat. A small kindness, the kind that costs almost nothing and means something for the exact duration of the moment it inhabits. Now he was looking out the window. He could see her reflection in the glass. He chose the window. The mother with 2 small children, 3 rows back, looked at Imani with the specific expression of a woman who knows what it feels like to stand somewhere with not enough money and too much need. She opened her mouth. She did not speak. Something closed the space between the intention and the word. Gerald pulled the lever. The doors opened. The cold came in. Imani stepped off the curb and onto the sidewalk. The doors closed behind her. The bus pulled forward. Gerald did not look in his mirror. He was back on schedule. Nobody said a word. The bus stop at 55th and Halsted was the kind of bus stop that existed on the south side of Chicago. A pole, a sign, nothing else. No shelter, no bench, no glass, no surface to block the wind that came off the lake and moved through a person without asking permission. Imani stood on the curb in 19-degree weather with one hand on her stomach and the other holding the plastic bag that contained the results of the appointment at which everything had been pronounced healthy. She did not cry. She was too cold to cry. Crying requires a certain minimum of safety, and she was below the minimum. 3 miles north, Gerald's route ended. He called the depot at 3:15. The roads were getting bad. He was ending his shift early. The dispatcher called Cedric at 3:22. Cedric had been home for 1 hour. He was sitting at the kitchen table eating a sandwich made from the last of the bread. He picked up the phone. He listened. Something moved through him that he did not examine directly the way you do not examine something you already know the answer to. He said yes. He always said yes. He drove to the depot. He signed in. He took the bus out on Route 63 southbound, running 12 minutes behind Gerald's abandoned schedule. He turned the heat to maximum and pulled onto the route and drove south through the snow. He was 3 blocks from 55th in Halsted when he saw her. She was standing at the pole, one hand on her stomach, the other holding a plastic bag. Snow on her shoulders, snow in her hair. She was not waving the bus down. She was not doing anything to make herself visible. She was simply standing there the way people stand when they have stopped expecting the next thing to be the thing that helps them, but have not yet decided to stop waiting. Cedric processed several things in the time it takes to process them, which is faster than thinking but slower than instinct. CTA Regulation 7.4. Operators may not make passenger stops at non-designated locations. His checking account, $340. His rent, $675. The 14 days until it was due. The 6 years of stability he had built after 28 years of nothing being stable. The pension that meant something because a pension meant you had stayed somewhere long enough for the staying to be worth something. He thought about all of that. Then he saw her hand on her stomach. Not a memory exactly, a shape. The shape of standing somewhere cold and watching things move past you without stopping. The shape of being 7 years old on Martin Luther King Drive and watching headlights sweep across you and keep going. Visible, ignored. The specific feeling that was worse than invisibility, because invisibility at least released you from the knowledge of having been seen. He reached across the seat. He picked up the jacket, navy blue. CTA regulation issue. One size too large. Folded on the seat beside him for 6 years. He unfolded it. He stood up. He stepped off the bus into the snow without wearing a jacket of his own. He walked to where she was standing. She looked up at him, and in her eyes was something that had been there since 4:47. Something that had been there longer than that, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been managing too much for too long without being allowed to stop. He put the jacket on her shoulders. She did not move. He said two things, two sentences, simple and direct, in the way that the only things worth saying are often simple and direct. Bus is warm. Come on. She looked at him for a moment. Something changed in her face. Not relief exactly. Something quieter than relief. Something that did not have a name for the particular moment when a door opens instead of closing. She said two words back, barely a whisper. Okay, thank you. He walked her to the bus. She stepped up. He followed. He sat down behind the wheel. He did not enter a fare. He did not log the stop. He pulled the lever. The doors closed. He turned the heat to maximum and pulled the bus back onto the road. He was 14 minutes behind schedule now. He did not look at the clock. Imani sat in the front row. The jacket was too big for her. The sleeves hung past her wrists and the shoulders sat wide on her frame, and the zipper did not close all the way over her stomach. The jacket smelled like the bus, like the heater and the vinyl and the particular neutral scent of someone who had been doing honest work in a small space for a long time. She pulled it around her shoulders and put both hands on her stomach and watched the snow through the windshield. The bus was quiet, not the ordinary quiet of people ignoring one another. A different quiet, the quiet of people who have just witnessed something and are still working out what it means. The girl in the second row, young maybe 19, stood up without a word and moved toward the back so Imani could sit closer to the heater vent. She did not explain the gesture. She simply relocated. The mother with the two children who had ridden Gerald's bus and watched the door close and said nothing had transferred at the previous stop. She was now on this bus. She was watching the back of Cedric's head, the absence of his jacket, and she was crying the way people cry when the tears are not about sadness, but about the specific recognition that they were present at a moment when something could have gone differently, and they chose the version that didn't. She did not wipe her face. Wiping would mean acknowledging, and acknowledging would mean having to name what she had done. Cedric drove with both hands on the wheel. The cold from outside pressed through the gap where the door seal had worn thin and not been replaced because Route 63 was the kind of route where things did not get replaced quickly. He felt the cold on his arms and the side of his neck. He did not feel heroic. He felt cold. Those two things were not contradictions. They were both simply true the way most true things are made of more than one part. He drove south through the snow. The city moved past the windows. The passengers rode in the quiet they had found and did not break it. And the jacket that had waited 6 years on the seat beside the driver's seat was warm on the shoulders of a young woman who was 7 months along and carrying something heavier than a clinic bag. And the bus was warm, and the heater was on high, and outside the snow kept coming down the way it does in February, which is not gently. They rode in silence for 7 minutes. Then Imani spoke without turning her head quiet almost to herself. She said, "Thank you." Cedric looked at her in the rearview mirror, the jacket around her shoulders, her hands still on her stomach. He said she did not have to thank him. She was quiet for a moment. Then, still looking at the window, she said, "People keep saying that, but nobody does it." He did not answer. He drove past 2 more stops. Then he said something he had not planned to say. He said his mother would have done the same thing. He did not know why he said it. He did not talk about Lorraine to strangers. But that was the thing about buses. You said things to strangers on buses that you did not say to the people who knew you because the strangers were leaving and the words could leave with them. Imani did not ask about his mother. She just nodded. The small nod of someone who understood that when a person mentions their mother in that tone, It is not an invitation to ask questions. It is a door being opened just enough to let the light through. She reached into the plastic bag from the clinic. She took something out not to show him, she just held it. A small piece of paper folded and refolded so many times that the creases had become part of it. She held it in her lap with both hands. The way you hold something that is not fragile but that you have decided to treat as though it is. Cedric saw it in the mirror. He did not ask what it was. He kept his eyes on the road. She kept her hands on the paper. The bus moved south. The cord pulled at her stop. Imani stood up slowly. She started to take the jacket off. She had one arm out of the sleeve when Cedric spoke without turning around. He told her to keep it. He said it was cold out there. She stopped. One arm in the jacket, one arm out. She looked at the back of his head, at the set of his shoulders, at the place where the jacket had sat every day for 6 years and was no longer sitting. She put her arm back in. She pulled the jacket around her. She walked to the door. She stepped off the bus into the snow. She did not look back. He did not watch her go. The doors closed. The bus moved forward. The jacket went south. Part 2. 3 days after Valentine's Day, Cedric sat in the office on 77th Street and looked at the incident report on the desk with his name on it. The man who had filed it was Gerald D. Pitts. The supervisor's name was Mitchell. He had a desk with a computer and a stack of papers in a coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Boss," which someone had given him as a joke, and which he had kept because he never realized it was a joke. Mitchell was not a cruel man. He was a man who had worked in a system long enough to have become fluent in its logic. And the system's logic said that procedures existed because procedures existed. And the moment you started making exceptions, the procedures became suggestions. And the moment they became suggestions, there was no longer a system at all. Just a series of decisions made by individuals who thought their circumstances were special. Everyone thought their circumstances were special. Mitchell read the violations aloud. Unscheduled stop at a non-designated location, failure to collect fare, exiting the vehicle during an active route. He asked Cedric if he had anything to say. Cedric said there was a pregnant woman standing in the snow. He stopped. Mitchell leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man who has heard something he did not expect and is deciding whether to acknowledge it or fold it into the category of things the system does not have space for. He chose to fold it. He explained that CTA policy was clear. There had been other cases. A driver in Cleveland had let a homeless man sleep on the bus during a cold snap and had been suspended. A driver in Milwaukee had given a stranded woman a ride home off route and had been terminated. The policy existed because the policy existed. He was sorry. He said it the way people say they are sorry when they are not sorry, but feel that the word is required. Cedric looked at him. He said he understood how the system worked. That was why he stopped. Mitchell was quiet for the length of time it takes a man to decide something. Then he pushed the paper across the desk. Cedric signed it. He turned in his badge. He walked out of the depot into the February air without a jacket because the jacket was somewhere on the south side of Chicago keeping someone else warm, and he did not have a second one. It was not until 3 weeks later when Otis in the next apartment mentioned that Gerald Pitts had driven Route 63 on the 14th and ended his shift early because of the weather that Cedric understood the full geometry of what had happened. Gerald had opened the door on the woman in the snow. Gerald had filed the report on the man who didn't. This was not malice. Cedric had to sit with that distinction for a while before he could hold it cleanly. Gerald had not filed the report out of hatred. Gerald had filed the report because if he didn't, then what Cedric had done would make what Gerald had done a choice. And Gerald could not live in a version of February 14th where he had made a choice. He needed it to be a policy. There are people who cause harm as a side effect of protecting the story they tell themselves. This is not cruelty. It is something more durable and more difficult to argue with than cruelty. And Cedric understood sitting at the kitchen table with no job and $340 in his account that understanding it did not make it cost any less. The math of February was simple and unkind. $340, $675 in rent, 14 applications in 3 weeks, warehouse positions and delivery routes, and a janitorial job at a school on the west side. The word terminated on every resume like a stain that explained itself before he had the chance to. Nobody called. Lorraine sent $200 through Western Union on the 1st of March. She did not ask if he needed it. She simply sent it the way she had always done things, without announcement, without waiting to be asked, because she could read the shape of a need from 4 hours away the same way she had always read it from across a kitchen. Cedric cashed the money order at the corner store and sat with the specific shame of a grown man kept alive by his mother. Not because the shame was reasonable, because it was there. Shame does not require logic to occupy a room. It only requires a room. He sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and filled out applications and thought about the 19 years Lorraine had worked nights at the plant and never once described herself as someone who was doing something extraordinary. The system she had given him was not a system of inspiration. It was a system of continuation. You got up, you went, you came back, you did it again. He had been doing it his whole life. He just needed a new form of it. The neighbor's car broke down on a Tuesday morning. Otis was 67 years old. He drove a 2003 Buick LeSabre that had been making a sound from under the hood for 2 months, a sound he had been ignoring because ignoring costs nothing and diagnosing costs money, and on a fixed income in the winter, you learn to narrow the range of what you are willing to hear. Cedric heard the sound from his apartment window. He went outside. He asked Otis to pop the hood. He looked at the engine the way his hands had learned to look at engines when he was 17 years old in East St. Louis, because when you cannot afford a mechanic, you become one, or at least you become enough of one to handle the problems that show up in the particular vehicles that people in your circumstances drive. He found the issue in 8 minutes. He fixed it in 32. The tools he used had belonged to Roland. After Roland left, Lorraine had kept them in the hall closet for 30 years, not out of sentiment, not out of anger, but because tools do not leave even when people do, and a good wrench does not care who held it last. It only does what it was built to do. When Cedric moved to Chicago, Lorraine had shipped the box without a note. Just the tools and the packing material in the cardboard. He had understood without needing an explanation that this was a form of inheritance. Not an endorsement, not a reconciliation, just the practical recognition that the tools existed and should go to someone who would use them. He used Roland's tools to fix Otis's car and thought for the first time in his adult life about his father, not with the specific gravity of someone who had been abandoned, but with something quieter and more honest. The tools worked. Whatever Roland had or hadn't been the tools had stayed, and the tools worked, and that was the whole of what Roland had left behind and the whole of what Cedric needed from it. Otis told his neighbor about the repair. His neighbor told a woman from church. By the end of March, Cedric was working on cars in the small lot behind the building 3 or 4 days a week. Not a business, no sign, no schedule, no rate card. Just a man and a set of tools and a reputation that traveled the way reputations travel in neighborhoods where people still talk to each other, which is quickly and without much embellishment. He did not charge much. Sometimes he did not charge at all. And then something shifted. Not a single moment, but a gradual realization, the kind that happens when you start seeing a pattern from a new angle and understand that the pattern has been there all along. The people bringing him cars were not coming because they had car problems. They were coming because they had transportation problems. Mrs. Gibbon on 64th Street had missed 2 dialysis appointments in February because the bus was late and the clinic held appointments for 15 minutes past the scheduled time before canceling them. Tanya Coleman on Woodlawn Avenue had lost a work shift because Route 63 was rerouted for construction without sufficient notice to riders. Devin, the teenager from the 3rd floor, had missed a college placement exam at Kennedy King because his transfer connection failed and he arrived after the testing center had closed. Cedric started writing it down. Names, addresses, where they needed to be, when, how far it was, whether the bus could get them there, and how often it didn't. He kept the list in a small notebook from the Dollar Tree on Cottage Grove. The notebook was yellow and cost 89 cents, and it became the most important object in Cedric's possession besides the tools. Then he started driving. Mrs. Gibbon to dialysis on Tuesdays, Tanya's mother to the pharmacy, Devin to the makeup date for his placement exam on a Friday morning in April. He drove the Buick that Otis had given him in exchange for the repairs because Otis had decided that at 67 his driving days were finished, and a car that sat in a lot was worse than a car being used for something that mattered. Cedric drove. He did not charge for the driving. He did not name what he was doing. He just did it the way Lorraine had carried the soup pot across the street in the dark. You do not have to fix everything. You just have to not walk past. Devin was the one who almost did not get in the car. Cedric had knocked on his door the Thursday before the retake mentioned in the exam, said he would be downstairs at 8:15 if Devin needed a ride. Devin had looked at him the way a teenager looks at a man he does not fully know, who is offering something for free with the specific wariness of someone who has been taught correctly that free often has a cost that reveals itself later. Cedric said nothing more. He just said he would be downstairs at 8:15 and left Devin to decide. The next morning, Cedric was in the lot at 8:13. Devin came down at 8:11. He got into the passenger seat and looked straight ahead and put his hands on his knees and said nothing for the first several minutes. Cedric drove. Devin looked out the window. About halfway there, Devin said quietly that he had failed the first time because he overslept. He said it like a confession, like he had been carrying the weight of it and needed somewhere to set it down. Cedric said that happened. Devin looked at him. He said that was it. That was all Cedric had to say. Cedric said Devin knew what had happened and probably knew what to do about it. He said Devin did not need Cedric to tell him that. He needed to pass the exam, so they should make sure he got there. Devin passed. He did not say anything to Cedric afterward, but the next week when Cedric was working on a car in the lot, Devin came down and asked if there was anything he could do to help. Cedric handed him a wrench and showed him where to use it. Imani wore the jacket every day. It was too large on her, with the sleeves past her wrists and the shoulders sitting wide, and the zipper that did not close all the way over the 8th month of a pregnancy that was making itself known more insistently each week. It smelled like the bus. She did not wash it. This was not carelessness. The smell was part of the proof of what had happened, and she needed the proof to be intact. She did not know the driver's name. She did not know his badge number or the number of the bus or what had caused a CTA operator to stop his vehicle outside a designated stop and step off into the snow to put his jacket on a stranger. She had ridden Route 63 on Fridays for months. She knew what she had seen: a man who got off the bus, a man who did not ask her name or what had happened or whether she could pay him back, a man who just opened a door. Her classmate Rashida saw the jacket one morning in the hallway of Malcolm X College, saw the CTA logo and the size that was clearly not Imani's, and asked whether Imani was really planning to wear that to clinicals. Imani looked at her. She said yes. Rashida waited for more. Nothing came. She nodded once and they walked to class. There was a woman named Cora who drove the Saturday routes. She was 58 years old, heavy-set and deliberate in her movements, with the specific efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that rushing created more problems than it solved. She drove a minivan that seated 7 and had on more than one occasion fit 8 when the situation warranted it. Cora did not advertise this flexibility. She simply made it available when it was needed and said nothing about it afterward. She had come to route home through her church, which was the same church on Cottage Grove, where the daycare was, where the Wednesday evening community meetings were held, where the bulletin board in the vestibule had carried a small notice about volunteer drivers for 3 months before Cora finally pulled it down and took it home and called the number the following morning. She told Cedric she had been thinking about it for a while. He said that was fine. He said the thinking time was not wasted. She looked at him. She said most people would have said, "Why did it take you so long?" He said most people had not tried to build something that required more drivers than they currently had. She laughed. She said she would take Saturdays. She also took Tuesday mornings when Mrs. Given called at 7 to say she was not feeling well, but needed to go anyway because there was a category of appointment that could be rescheduled and a category that couldn't, and dialysis was in the second category. Cora drove those mornings with the specific gentleness of someone who understood the difference between being sick and being defeated by being sick, and who was determined that the second thing would not happen on her watch. Mrs. Given had over the months developed a complicated relationship with the drivers. She was not sentimental about being driven. She was clear-eyed about what the service was and what it meant and what it did not mean, which was that it was not charity and it was not pity and it was not the city suddenly deciding to care about her. It was people who had looked at a gap and filled it, and she was one of the people the gap had held, and the filling of it was practical and good, and she appreciated it in the way she appreciated any practical and good thing, which was without excessive demonstration. What she did do and what she had done almost from the beginning, was show up 2 minutes early. This was not an accident. Mrs. Gibbon had spent enough of her 68 years waiting for things that were supposed to come and didn't, that she had developed as a counterweight the habit of arriving before the thing she was waiting for could fail to arrive. If she was there first, the thing could not leave without her. This was not an efficient use of the logic, but it was an emotionally satisfying one, and she had decided that at 68, she was entitled to her emotionally satisfying logics. Cedric understood this without being told. He had noted it on the second week, had said nothing about it, had simply ensured that whoever was driving the Tuesday and Thursday routes was in the lot behind the clinic by 7:05. The insurance question had been the moment that nearly ended the program before it started. Walter Hines was 71 years old and had experienced a stroke 4 years earlier that had left him with limited mobility on his left side. During his recovery, he had missed 3 consecutive physical therapy appointments because he could not get himself to the clinic and did not have reliable transportation, and the therapist had noted in his file that the gaps in treatment were likely the reason his recovery was taking longer than projected. He had read this note in his own file and felt something he later described to Cedric as a particular kind of anger. Not anger at the therapist, who was accurate, and not anger at himself, who had done what he could. Anger at the fact that a logistical problem had been written into his medical record as a clinical one, that the city's failure to provide adequate transit had been absorbed into the language of individual insufficiency. He had spent 7 years running his insurance agency with this specific knowledge living in his chest, and when Amani came in with the route home proposal and described what the program was for, he had recognized, in the way that people recognize things they have been waiting to be useful about, that this was the thing he had been waiting for. He charged 40% below his standard rate. He also did something he had not mentioned when Amani came in, which was that he called 3 colleagues in the insurance industry and described the program and asked if any of them wanted to be part of something that mattered. 2 of them said no. One of them, a woman named Felicia Bryant, who ran a small agency in Bronzeville and who had her own reasons for caring about healthcare access on the South Side, said yes. She took on one of the 3 clinic partnerships at a similarly reduced rate when Root Home expanded to a second location. Cedric did not know about any of this until Felicia called the dispatch room one afternoon in September to introduce herself and explain that she had heard about the program from Walter and that she had been handling the insurance for the second clinic for 3 months. He called Walter. Walter said he should have mentioned it sooner. He said he had been watching to see if the second clinic would stick before he said anything, because he did not want to complicate the paperwork before the thing was established. Cedric said he appreciated that. Walter said the thing about people who do practical work is that they trust practical gestures. He said, "I figured you would understand when I told you." Cedric said he did. He wrote Walter's full name in the notebook under the operating notes section he had started keeping in the back, the record of the architecture of how the thing worked, who had done what and when and why, so that when he was gone, or when Devin or someone like Devin eventually took over, the history of the thing would be readable. Not as a monument, as a manual. There was a Tuesday in October when everything that could go wrong in a single morning went wrong. The Buick would not start. Cedric was at the clinic by 6:30. He heard about the Buick at 6:42 when Otis called from the lot. He called Marcus, who was between routes and could be there in 12 minutes, but had his own pickup at 7:15 and could not do both. He called Cora, who was on a Saturday but answered her phone on the first ring and said she could get there in 20 minutes. But that was too late for Mrs. Gibbons, 7 o'clock. He thought for 4 seconds. Then he called Devin. Devin was 19 and had his license and had been driving routes under supervision for 2 months and had not yet driven a route alone. He was also 3 blocks from Mrs. Gibbons' building, having just gotten off a night shift and was walking home. Devin answered on the second ring. Cedric explained the situation. Devin was quiet for 1 second. He said, "I can be there in 4 minutes." He was there in 3. He picked up Mrs. Gibbon, who got into Devin's car without comment and rode to the dialysis center and arrived 4 minutes before her appointment. When Devin called Cedric from the clinic parking lot to say they had made it, his voice had the specific quality of someone who has just discovered something about themselves that they suspected but had not yet confirmed. Cedric said, "Good work." Devin said, "I did not have time to be nervous." Cedric said, "That is usually how it works." Devin drove his own routes after that. Not because of the Buick breaking down, though that was the occasion. Because of the 4 seconds Cedric had spent thinking before calling him which Devon understood correctly as the calculation of someone who had decided that Devon was ready and had been waiting for the right moment to demonstrate it. Zora came on a Wednesday morning in early April. Denise drove them to the University of Chicago Medical Center at 4:15 in the morning. She had rehearsed this drive mentally more than 100 times since Rosalind had closed, had memorized every possible delay, every light, every backup route, because the moment that mattered was never the moment you had time to figure things out. They arrived at 5:02. The labor war was the kind of bright that exists only in hospitals and in the specific places where things begin or end. Imani was in a gown and on a bed and doing the things she had spent months studying how to help other women do, and she was discovering, as every person who has ever prepared extensively for an experience discovers, that preparation and living are two entirely separate categories of knowledge. At one point, halfway through, the monitors showed a brief deceleration in the baby's heartbeat. Not dangerous. The nurse adjusted the position, rechecked the readings, said it was normal. But for 45 seconds, Imani looked at the ceiling, and a thought moved through her that was not a thought so much as a sequence of images. The bus stop, the snow, the door that had already closed, the door that opened, the jacket on her shoulders, the 45 seconds in which, if a single decision had gone differently on a specific February evening, she would not be in this room. Then the heartbeat steadied. The nurse nodded. Denise squeezed her hand, and the rest of the morning carried forward the way mornings do when they are building towards something that is going to change everything. Zora arrived at 7:41, 6 pounds, 11 ounces, with the particular expression of a person encountering the world for the first time and already taking notes. Imani named her without explanation. The name said what it needed to say if you knew where to look. Denise held the baby for a long time without speaking. Then she said she looked like she already knew things. Imani laughed, the tired laugh, the one that comes after hours of work, unlike any other work, when the result is breathing and looking at you with eyes that have never seen light before and are deciding what they think of it. The jacket was folded on the chair beside the bed. She had worn it to the hospital, removed it when she changed into the gown, and folded it the same way it had been folded on the seat beside the driver. It sat on the chair while Denise held Zora, and Imani looked at the chair and the jacket and her daughter, and for the first time since February, she thought not about herself in the snow, but about the man who had stepped out of the bus into the cold without being asked. She did not know what it had cost him. She thought quietly to no one in particular that she should find him. She did not know yet how long that would take. Woodlawn Community Health Center sat on the corner of a street that had seen the slow subtraction of resources and the equally slow accumulation of need, with the gap between those two things widening each year in the manner of a wound that does not heal. Imani arrived for her clinical rotation in late May, 2 weeks after graduation. She was 23 years old, carrying Zora in a cotton sling, and she was learning the specific rhythms of a community clinic. The missed appointment rate was between 15 and 20% each month. Imani began keeping her own records. Transportation was listed as the primary reason in 61% of the missed appointment explanations she could find. She brought the numbers to Dr. Sandra Reeves one morning in early June. Reeves was 58 years old and had been the director of the Woodlawn Clinic for 11 years. She had seen programs proposed and fail, had seen funding cycles that ended before they accomplished anything. She had not become cynical. She had become precise. There was a difference. She listened to Imani lay out the numbers. She was quiet for a long moment after Imani finished. Then she said, transportation is not a medical problem. It is a city problem. Imani did not argue. She took the numbers back to her desk and added more rows to the chart and spent the next 2 evenings building a more detailed case. She was not angry at Reeves. She understood what Reeves was doing. Reeves was asking her to prove it. She would prove it. On a Thursday morning in June, Imani stepped outside the clinic to watch for Mrs. Gibbon, who had called to say she was running a few minutes behind. A Buick with rust on the passenger door pulled up to the curb. A man got out of the driver's side and walked around to the passenger side and opened the door for an older woman who stepped out, slowly adjusting her bag. Imani watched the man. He was in his mid-30s. He was not wearing a jacket. He stood beside the car and waited while Mrs. Gibbon arranged herself. He did not rush her. He did not check his phone. He simply stood with the particular patience of a man who is used to waiting for people who need more time and who has made peace with that fact. Imani recognized the posture before the face. She did not recognize his face. She recognized the way he stood. Mrs. Gibbon walked past her into the clinic. The man turned back toward the car. He saw Imani standing at the entrance. He looked at her. He did not recognize her. Then his eyes moved down. He looked at the jacket. Navy blue CTA issue. One size too large zipped halfway up over the white scrub top. He stopped. She said you stopped the bus. He looked at the jacket. He looked at her. He looked at what she was carrying against her chest in a cotton sling, a baby 2 months old, with her eyes closed and her hands curled into fists no larger than 2 small plums. He did not speak for a moment. Then he said she had kept the jacket. She said he had given it away in February without asking whether he was going to get it back. They stood there in the morning air outside the Woodlawn Clinic. Neither of them moved. Then she said, "This is Zora." He looked at the baby. He looked at her for a long time. Then quietly, almost to himself, he said something that landed in the space between them and stayed there. "She looks warm." She looked at him when he said it. She did not know yet why those 3 words sounded like the conclusion of something. She did not know about the bus stop in East St. Louis in 1996, or the woman in the dark blue coat, or the 3 words that had lived in Cedric's body for 27 years before he was able to pass them forward. She only knew that something about the way he said it had the quality of a door closing very quietly at the end of a long hallway. They sat on the bench outside the clinic and they talked. Not deliberately, not in the manner of 2 people who have decided to collaborate. In the manner of 2 people who start describing the same room from opposite ends and slowly realize that the room is the same. She told him about the missed appointments, about the 15 to 20%, about the 61% who gave transportation as the reason. He took out the yellow notebook from his back pocket and opened it. She read the names. She stopped at the 3rd one. She looked up. She found the 4th. She looked up again. 3 of his names were her patients. She looked at Cedric across the bench. They had been filling the same gap from opposite sides of it for months without knowing the other existed. She said the clinic did not have a transportation budget. He said he did not have a budget at all. She said there were federal models, programs that connected volunteer drivers to clinics and hospitals, grant funding available through the Department of Health and Human Services, frameworks that worked in other cities in Michigan and Missouri when someone was willing to do the work of building them. He listened carefully. He listened the way he drove, which was with full attention and no excess movement. Then he said he had never formalized anything in his life. He had spent his whole life doing things because they needed to be done, not because there was a structure around doing them. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "You do not have to do this alone." He looked back at her. No one had said that to him before. Not because no one cared, but because no one had been standing close enough to the same problem to see that he was already inside it. They did not shake hands. They did not make promises. They simply stood up and went back to their respective work, and the seriousness of what they had said to each other settled over the day, the way things settle when they are true and both people know it. That evening, for the first time in 4 months, Cedric called Lorraine and did not have to search for the right way to describe what he was doing. He just described it. Part 3, she had been writing the grant proposal for 11 days when she found the error. It was past midnight. Zora was asleep in the bassinet 3 feet from the kitchen table, breathing with the total commitment that newborns bring to sleep. The apartment was quiet in the way apartments get quiet after a baby goes down, a quiet that feels earned and therefore fragile. And Imani moved carefully through it even when there was no particular reason to. She had the proposal open on the screen and a printed copy beside the laptop with handwritten notes filling the margins, and she was going through the budget section for the 4th time when she found it. She had built the per-ride cost estimate on fuel data from a report published 18 months earlier before 2 consecutive price increases had moved the real number. The corrected figure changed the per-ride estimate from $11.40 to $14.20. Across a full projected year of operation, the difference was $9,300, which was more than the contingency buffer she had built into the budget. She sat with the number for a while. She could leave it. The source she had cited was real and publicly available, and the discrepancy was the kind that auditors sometimes missed and reviewers often excused. She closed the laptop. She opened it again. She fixed the number. She rebuilt the budget section line by line from that point forward. It took 2 hours and 20 minutes. When she finished, the contingency was gone and the program was leaner, but the numbers were honest and Dr. Reeves had been specific about what the standard was, and the standard was not almost right. She sent the revised version to Cedric at 2:47 in the morning with a note explaining what had changed. He replied at 2:51. His message was brief. He said the number was right before she fixed it and right now. He said both of those things mattered. He said to get some sleep. She read the message twice. She closed the laptop. She checked on Zora, once more touching the side of the bassinet lightly in the way that parents touch things near sleeping children, not to disturb but to confirm. Then she went to bed. Thursday, the meeting with Reeves. Imani had prepared a one-page summary of the budget change before she came in, laying out the original figure, the corrected figure, the source of the error, and the adjustment it required. She set it on the desk before Reeves could open the proposal itself. Reeves read the summary. She set it down. She asked if Imani had found the error herself. Imani said yes. Reeves was quiet for a moment. She had the specific stillness of someone who is recalibrating. Then she said that in 11 years she had reviewed a significant number of grant proposals, and she could name without difficulty the applicants who had voluntarily corrected a figure that worked in their favor before submission. She said the number was small. She said the revised budget did not make the proposal easier to fund. It made it something more important than easy to fund. It made it trustworthy. She initialed the revised budget page. Then she said she was going to make 2 phone calls that afternoon to people she knew at the Department of Health and Human Services regional office. She said the calls would open a door. What happened after the door opened depended on the quality of the work and the people doing it. Imani thanked her. Reeves said not to thank her yet. She said to come back when they had the check. The calls produced a contact. Her name was Patricia Okafor. She was a program officer at the regional HHS office, 44 years old with 7 years in community health access, and the particular discernment of someone who received 40 funding inquiries a month and had learned to identify within the first 2 paragraphs of a proposal whether the people behind it understood the problem or merely sympathized with it. She responded to the Woodlawn proposal within 48 hours. Her email said the proposal was well constructed. It said the budget revision demonstrated institutional honesty. It said the current funding cycle had closed 6 weeks ago. It said the next cycle opened in 4 months. It said if Imani submitted a letter of intent within 10 days, Okafor would ensure full committee review. Imani read the email 3 times at the intake desk between patients. Then she called Cedric. He was in the lot behind the building, standing under an open hood. He listened to her read the email. He was quiet for a moment. He said 4 months. She said yes. He said they had 4 months to prove it worked before they asked anyone to fund it. She said that was one way to look at it. He said it was the only way that made sense to him. He said they had the drivers and the insurance in the room. He said to send the letter. She sent it that evening. What followed was not a clean 4 months. It was not organized or sequential or built on a foundation of sufficient rest. It was the kind of 4 months that happens when 2 people are trying to build something real while simultaneously managing the other things that their lives require, and the other things did not reduce themselves out of consideration for the project. Imani was preparing for her licensing board scheduled for February. She was working 3 days a week at the clinic as a graduate nurse under Reeves's supervision. She was getting up twice a night with Zora, who was 4 months old in November and 5 months old in December, and who was healthy and growing and entirely indifferent to the significance of the grant deadline. Cedric was driving 6 days a week. He drove Mrs. Given to dialysis every Tuesday and Thursday without exception. He drove a man named Harold to the VA hospital on the west side every other Friday. He drove Patrice Williams and her son to the asthma clinic on the first Monday of every month and waited in the parking lot because Patrice did not have a way back that was reliable enough to risk a missed pickup. He drove Devin to Kennedy King on the mornings Devin had early classes, and the first bus from Devin's block did not run until 7:40, which was 10 minutes after Devin needed to be sitting down. Devin had started asking to drive some routes himself on the days when his schedule allowed, and in December, Cedric had begun letting him sitting in the passenger seat without commenting on Devin's driving, because Devin's driving did not require comment. Harold was the one who almost did not come back. In January, Harold missed a Friday appointment. He called Cedric at 6 in the morning to say he was not feeling well enough to go. Cedric said all right and noted it. The following Friday, Harold called again. Cedric drove to his building and went upstairs and knocked on the door. Harold opened it after a long moment. He was wearing a jacket inside which told Cedric something about the apartment's heating situation, and he looked the way people look when they have been spending too much time in a small space not doing anything in particular. Cedric said he was there for the Friday run. Harold said he had already missed one appointment. Cedric said he knew. He said that was the appointment they were going to now. Harold looked at him. He said it was 2 weeks late. Cedric said better late than not at all, and that the VA's position on that was probably similar. Harold stood in the doorway for a moment, then he went and got his coat. In the car about halfway to the VA, Harold said something Cedric had not expected. He said he had been thinking about what it would have cost him before route home to get to those appointments. Not money, the other cost. The cost of showing up somewhere repeatedly and being processed by a system that treated your presence as a logistics problem rather than as the arrival of a person who had served and was owed something. He said there was a kind of fatigue that built up over years of that, and it was not laziness and it was not apathy, but it looked like both of those things from the outside, and the outside was the only angle most people bothered with. Cedric drove. Harold said the car matters because of what it says before it says anything. It says somebody is coming for you. That is different. Cedric said he understood. Harold said he knew Cedric understood. He said that was why he had gotten into the car the first time. They rode the rest of the way without speaking, and when Harold walked into the VA building, Cedric stayed in the lot until he saw Harold's back disappear through the entrance door, because that was what he did not as a policy, just as the natural completion of the thing he had come to do. He sat in the Buick in the parking lot for a few minutes after Harold went inside. A man in scrubs walked from the entrance to a car 3 rows over. A woman in a wheelchair was being pushed by someone who appeared to be her daughter. The younger woman leaning into the chair's handles against the grate of the pavement, saying something that made the older woman's shoulders move, the way shoulders move when someone is laughing. Cedric watched them without watching them, the way you observe a scene that has nothing to do with you, but that gives you something anyway, something about what ordinary Tuesday mornings contained if you sat still long enough to let them arrive. He thought about Harold's word, different. The car matters because of what it says. Somebody is coming for you. He had not thought about it in those terms before. He had thought about the driving as practical as the filling of a gap between where people were and where they needed to be, a logistics problem approached as a logistics problem. Harold had named something underneath that. The car in front of the building at the scheduled time said something that the bus that did not come could not say. It said that someone had planned for your presence, that in a sequence of decisions made by a person you might not know well, your arrival at a specific place at a specific time had been given weight. Harold had been getting that message every other Friday for 4 months. That was why he got in the car. Cedric drove back to the clinic. February, the licensing board examination was held on a Thursday morning at a testing center on the north side. Imani took the first bus transferred once arrived 17 minutes early. She sat in the waiting room with the other candidates and did not look at her notes because she had decided the week before that looking at notes in the waiting room was a way of telling herself she was not ready, and she was ready. The examination took 3 hours and 14 minutes. She submitted her answers. She walked out into the February air and stood on the sidewalk and felt the cold on her face and thought about nothing in particular for about 90 seconds, which was the first 90 seconds in several months in which she had no specific thing she was supposed to be doing. Then she took out her phone and called Denise. Denise answered on the first ring. She asked how it went. Imani said she thought she had passed. Denise said, "You passed." Imani said she didn't have the results yet. Denise said, "You passed." The results arrived 4 weeks later. She had passed. She was a licensed registered nurse. She looked at the notification on her phone for a moment. She was standing in the break room at the clinic when it arrived between patients with a cup of coffee that had gone cold because she had not remembered to drink it. She looked at the screen. She put the phone in her pocket. She picked up her coffee. She drank it cold. Then she went back to the intake desk and called in her next patient. Reeves found out at the end of the day when the clinic administrator updated the staff credentials board. She came to the intake desk and said, "Congratulations, Nurse Webb." The title was not ceremonial. It was a fact that had just become official, And Reeves said it with the weight of someone who understood the distance between where Imani had started and where she was standing. Imani said, "Thank you." Reeves said, "Now let us talk about the grant review." The committee review was scheduled for a Wednesday in March. Imani spent 2 weeks preparing, not preparing the way people prepare when they want to make a good impression. Preparing the way people prepare when they know that the thing they are presenting is real, and that the only way to do it justice is to know it more completely than anyone else in the room. She ran the presentation twice for Cedric, and once for Reeves, and once for Otis, who listened with the serious attention of a man who had spent 67 years acquiring the ability to distinguish between things that were impressive and things that were true, and who said afterward that it was both, which was the best review she received. She ran it one more time alone, standing in the kitchen at 11 at night with Zora asleep, and the lights low, speaking to the empty room in a voice that was quieter than the one she would use in the committee room, but that carried everything she needed to know was in the words. She was ready. The committee was 5 people. The room was on the 4th floor of a building downtown with windows that looked out over the river, and the river was the gray-green of early March, moving with the slow deliberateness of water that has been cold for a long time and has not yet decided to warm up. Imani noted the river when she came in and then did not look at it again. 3 of the panelists had reviewed the written proposal. One, a woman named Dr. Annette Sears, had visited the dispatch room 2 weeks prior and ridden along on 2 routes, including the Tuesday run to the dialysis center where she had sat in the back seat of Otis's Buick and watched Mrs. Gibbon get out at the clinic entrance and walk in with her bag held in both arms. The 5th panelist was a man named Gerald Whitmore, no relation to anyone in this story, who had spent the first 8 minutes of the presentation looking at his phone. Imani presented for 22 minutes. She opened with the number that mattered most, which was not the dollar amount, but the 47 patients in the first month who had gotten to their appointments. She moved through the cost structure, the insurance arrangement, the volunteer-driver model, the outcome metrics from the first 4 months of operation. She talked about the budget correction because Reeves had told her that transparency about the correction was not a liability, but an asset, and Reeves had been right about most things. Gerald Whitmore put his phone face down on the table when she mentioned the budget correction. The questions lasted 35 minutes. Dr. Sears asked about driver retention beyond the initial volunteer pool, which was the right question and one Imani had prepared for. A second panelist asked about the institutional relationship with the clinic and what happened to the program if that relationship changed. A third asked about the patient population overlap with existing Medicaid transportation programs. Imani answered each question from her preparation. She said twice that she did not know the answer to a specific detail, but could provide it in writing within 48 hours. She provided both within 24. Gerald Whitmore asked one question. He asked how Cedric had come to start driving people to appointments before there was any program structure around it. Imani looked at him. She said a man had lost his job for stopping his bus on a night when a bus needed to stop. And when you lose a job for doing the right thing, the question that stays with you is not how to get the job back, but how to keep doing the thing that cost you it. Gerald Whitmore nodded slowly. He wrote something on the notepad in front of him. He did not look at his phone again for the remainder of the meeting. The award letter arrived on a Friday afternoon 6 weeks later. Imani was at the intake desk. She opened the email and read the first paragraph, and then read the number in the funding section, and then read the first paragraph again because she wanted to be certain she had read the number correctly. She had. She picked up her phone. She called Cedric. He answered on the second ring. She read him the number. He was quiet. She waited. He said, "All right." She laughed, not a polite laugh or a surprised one. The laugh of someone who has been building towards something long enough that arrival feels less like surprise and more like recognition. Like the moment a door opens that you knew would eventually open, but that required you to keep standing in front of it. She said, was that really all he had to say? He said it was enough. He said she should tell Reeves. He said he would call the drivers. She walked down the hallway to Reeves's office. She knocked. Reeves looked up from her desk. Imani held up the phone. Reeves read the number on the screen. She stood up. She came around the desk. She shook Imani's hand firmly, the handshake of a woman marking an arrival with the weight it had earned. Then she said something unexpected. She said she owed Imani an apology. She said it clearly without softening the edges of it, because softening an apology was a way of taking back what you were giving. She said that in June she had told Amani that transportation was a city problem and not a medical problem, and that she had been wrong, and that the wrongness had not been a matter of incomplete information, because the information Amani had provided in June was sufficient to warrant serious consideration, and she had not given it that. She said she had been protecting herself against the specific disappointment that comes from believing in something that fails, and that self-protection was a reasonable instinct, but that it was not a reason to dismiss evidence, and she had let one override the other. She said, "I want you to remember this the next time someone brings you something you do not want to believe." Amani looked at her. She said she would remember it. Reeves said, "Good." She said, "Now, come back when you have the check." She smiled when she said it. Amani smiled back. It was a different exchange than the first time Reeves had said those words, which was the difference between a warning and a ritual. The second time it was a ritual. The second time it meant they were on the same side. Lorraine called that evening without knowing about the grant. She called because a certain amount of time had passed and it was time to call, which was how she always operated on an internal calendar that tracked her children across distance with an accuracy that technology had not improved upon, Cedric told her. She was quiet with the particular quality of silence that meant she was processing something good, which was distinguishable from the silence of processing something difficult, though both were long and neither was impatient. Then she said, "You know what this is?" She did not wait for his answer. She said this was what it looked like when a chain held. She said Dorothy had stopped and something started. She said he had stopped and something continued. She said Amani had been stopped and then kept going, and now something was larger than any of the three of them. She said that was how it worked when people did not walk past. She said she wanted to come back in October. She said she wanted to see the room. He said she should come. He said he would put her on a route. She said she was not going to sit in any car she could not see the exit from clearly. He laughed. She said she was serious. He said he knew. He said she could ride with Otis. She said she would think about it. They talked for a while longer about things that were not the grant, about Zora, and about the weather in East St. Louis, and about a woman from Lorraine's church who had recently retired and was looking for something to do with her mornings, a detail Lorraine mentioned without emphasis, but that contained Cedric understood the outline of a suggestion. He said he would call her. Lorraine said she had already given the woman his number. He said of course she had. The first time Cedric tried to explain Route Home to someone who had not been involved in building it was in April at a neighborhood association meeting that Reeves had suggested he attend. The meeting was held in the basement of the church on Cottage Grove on a Wednesday evening, attended by about 30 people, most of them older, most of them residents of Woodlawn, who had been attending meetings like this one for decades and who brought to their participation the specific skepticism of people who had watched many things be announced and fewer things be delivered. Cedric was not a public speaker. He knew this about himself. He could explain things to individuals with clarity and without excess, but standing in front of a room required a different kind of presence. He stood at the front with a single page of handwritten notes and said he was going to tell them what the program was and what it had done so far, and then stopped talking. He said Route Home drove people to medical appointments when they had no other reliable way to get there. He said it was free. He said it served 3 clinics on the south side. He said the drivers were volunteers from the neighborhood and the cars were donated. He said the program was funded by a federal grant that covered operations for 18 months. He stopped talking. A man in the third row, maybe 70 years old, wearing a blue vest over a white shirt, raised his hand. He asked if there was a waiting list. Cedric said there was a list of people who had requested the service and that they were working through it as driver availability allowed. The man said his wife needed to get to a kidney specialist on the north side every 3 weeks. He said the round trip by bus took almost 3 hours, and his wife could not manage 3 hours anymore. Cedric wrote the man's name in the notebook. A woman near the back said her neighbor had a standing appointment at a wound care clinic that she had been missing for 2 months because her daughter, who had been driving her, had taken a second job and could no longer do the Tuesday mornings. The wound was not healing correctly. The clinic had called twice. Cedric wrote the neighbor's name and address and the day of the appointment. By the time the meeting moved on to other business, Cedric had 6 new names in the notebook. He had not said anything except what the program was and what it had done. The room had filled in the rest. Walking back to his car after the meeting, he passed the man in the blue vest on the sidewalk. The man stopped him. He said he had heard about what had happened at the CTA. He said word traveled in this neighborhood. Cedric said he knew. The man said the thing is my wife was on that bus sometimes. Route 63. She said the driver always waited the extra few seconds when he saw someone coming. Never made a show of it, just waited. Cedric said he remembered trying to do that. The man looked at him. He said that mattered. He said it probably mattered to people who never told him and never would. Cedric said he understood. The man said, I know you do. That is why I am telling you anyway. October. Lorraine arrived on a Thursday afternoon on the Greyhound from East St. Louis. Cedric picked her up from the bus station. She got off the bus with her single bag and looked at him in the full reading way she always looked at him, and she saw what she had seen in April when he called about the grant, which was that settled quality, the quality of someone who had found the thing they were supposed to be doing. She did not say this. She put her bag in the back seat and got in the car and asked him how Zora was doing. He said she was walking now. Lorraine said she had walked early. She said Cedric had also walked early and that he had walked directly into the most inconvenient furniture in the room on his first independent attempt. He said he did not remember that. She said she knew. She said that was what mothers were for. She met Zora that evening at Imani's apartment where they had gathered for dinner. Denise was there. The apartment was warm and the food was the kind of food that accumulates when two families meet for the first time, more dishes than strictly necessary. Lorraine held Zora for a long time. Zora regarded her with the serious data-collecting gaze she brought to most new experiences. Then she reached out and grabbed one of Lorraine's fingers with both hands and held on with the grip that small children deploy, without warning or apparent reason, the grip that simply means I am here and so are you. Lorraine looked at Zora's hands on her finger. She looked up at Cedric. She said nothing. She did not need to. The following morning, Lorraine rode with Otis on the Tuesday route. She sat in the back seat of the Buick in her good coat, the one she reserved for occasions that warranted it, because she had decided that a first ride on a route that her son had built with his hands and his conscience and his willingness to lose the thing he had earned was an occasion that warranted it. The first stop was Mrs. Gibbons' building. Mrs. Gibbon came out the entrance door at 7:13, 2 minutes early, wearing the blue coat Imani had seen on launch morning. She got in the passenger seat and settled herself, and then she saw Lorraine in the back seat and paused. She said good morning. She said she did not know there was a passenger today. Otis said, Mrs. Gibbon, this is Cedric's mother. She is riding along this morning. Mrs. Gibbon turned to look at Lorraine properly. She looked at her for a moment with the specific appraisal of one older woman looking at another. She said, you raised him. Lorraine said she had. Mrs. Gibbon turned back to face the front. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, then thank you for that. Lorraine looked out the window. The city went past. She did not say anything for a long time. When they reached the clinic and Mrs. Gibbon had gone inside, Otis sat in the parked car for a moment before pulling away. He looked at Lorraine in the rearview mirror. He said, you all right? She said she was fine. She said she had just not expected someone to say that to her. Otis said people do not say it enough. She said she knew. She said it was still something to hear. After the morning routes were done, Cedric found his mother in the dispatch room. She was standing in front of the jacket on the wall. She was not touching it. She was just looking at it the way she had looked at Cedric that morning, reading it, understanding it through some capacity that did not require explanation. He stood in the doorway. She said, it looks right there. He said he thought so too. She said, you know what I think about when I look at it? He said he did not know. She said she thought about Roland's tools in the hall closet. She said she had kept them for 30 years and had not known when she first put them there why she was keeping them. She said she had known they were right to keep even when she could not explain the reason, and that the reason had shown up eventually the way reasons sometimes did later than expected and exactly when needed. She said some things were meant to wait. He looked at the jacket on the wall. He said she had a name, Dorothy. He said he thought about her differently now that he knew her name. Lorraine said she knew. He said he thought about what she did not know, that she had driven a boy home, and the boy had grown up and kept a jacket on a seat for 6 years, and the jacket had found its way to a woman in the snow, and the woman had carried it for 4 months, and now it was hanging on a wall in a room that had not existed before any of them made the choices that led to its existing. He said Dorothy never knew any of that. Lorraine said no. She said the thing about not walking past was that you usually did not get to see where the step took you. She said you did it because not doing it was not something you could live with, and then you went home and got on with things. And somewhere you would never reach the step kept going. She said Dorothy went home and got on with things. She said she probably thought about that boy sometimes. She said she probably did not know he thought about her. She said that was all right. She said the not knowing was part of it. She said that is why you keep doing it even when you do not see the result. Because the result is happening somewhere you cannot see. That is not a reason not to do it. That is the reason to do it. Cedric looked at his mother. He said he understood. She said she knew he did. She said she had known for a while. She picked up her bag. She said she was going to spend the afternoon with Zora and Denise. She said she expected dinner. He said he would pick up food on his way home. She said she would make something. She said he had a kitchen and he should use it occasionally for things that were not sandwiches made from the last of the bread. He said he would be home by 6. She said to make it 5:30. He said 5:30. She left. He turned back to the whiteboard. The afternoon routes were up, 3 runs before 4 o'clock. He picked up the phone and made the first call. 2 years after launch, morning route home had 6 vehicles. The 6th had come from a donation. A woman named Carolyn Marsh, 61 years old, a retired school teacher from Beverly, had read a profile of the program in a community newspaper. She said she had a 2015 Honda that she no longer needed and that she wanted it to go somewhere it would be used for something that mattered. Cedric said yes. Carolyn brought it washed and with a full tank and a small card tucked under the windshield wiper that said simply, "Use it well." Cedric found the card when he moved the car into the lot. He brought it inside and pinned it to the bulletin board next to Mrs. Gibbons' photograph. The following month, when Carolyn came by to see how things were going, she saw the card on the board and stood in front of it for a long moment without saying anything. Then she said she wanted to drive. Cedric said they were always looking for drivers. She said she meant she wanted to drive a route. She said she had 30 years of early mornings from teaching and she had nothing to do with them now. He put her through the vetting process. She passed without difficulty. The following Tuesday, she drove her own donated car on the route to the dialysis center and picked up Mrs. Gibbon, who looked at the unfamiliar driver and asked where Otis was. Carolyn said Otis had Thursday. She said she had Tuesday. Mrs. Gibbon said, well, she got in. What Carolyn brought to the routes was different from what the other drivers brought. She noticed things. She noticed that Devin, when he rode along to observe the dispatch process in November, sat forward in his seat and watched the route with the focus of someone who was memorizing it. She mentioned this to Cedric afterward. She said that boy was going to do something with what he was learning. Cedric said he knew. Carolyn said, do you tell him that Cedric said Devin knew? Carolyn looked at him with the patient directness of someone who had spent 30 years telling young people things they needed to hear because nobody else had. She said, tell him anyway. Cedric called Devin that evening. He said he had been watching Devin learn the routes and that he thought Devin understood what the work was about, not just the driving, but the reason for it. Devin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, you really think so? Cedric said he did. Devin said he was going to apply for a community health administration program at Kennedy King in the spring. Cedric said to apply and find out. Devin applied. He was admitted in March. He continued driving routes on the mornings his schedule allowed, and he started taking notes on the dispatch process and the scheduling and the coordination between drivers and clinics in the same careful way that Cedric had started writing names in a yellow notebook 2 years before, because people who have been shown a way of paying attention tend to carry that attention forward into whatever they do next. The morning that Amani presented to the Chicago Department of Public Health was a Thursday in January, 14 months after the grant award letter had arrived. She had been preparing for this presentation for 9 weeks. Not the same way she had prepared for the grant committee, which was in the manner of someone who needed to prove the work was possible. This time the work had already happened. She was not asking anyone to believe that it would work. She was showing them that it had and asking them to take the next step, which was to treat the problem the work had addressed as a problem the city was responsible for solving at scale. The room was on the 3rd floor of the City Hall Annex. There were 11 people in the room. 3 of them were senior staff from the Department of Public Health. 2 were from the Office of Budget Management. 1 was from the mayor's office, a young man named Terrell, who took notes in a small notebook and had the expression of someone whose job was to listen and report rather than decide. The remaining 5 were representatives from community organizations on the South Side, people who had been doing health access work for years, and who had been invited by Reeves to attend because Reeves understood that the city responded to evidence and to organize voices in roughly equal measure, and that having both in the room was better than having only one. Imani presented for 25 minutes. She showed the data, she showed the maps, she showed what the gap looked like before Route Home and what it looked like after, and she showed the limits of what Route Home could do because the limits were part of the argument. The limits were the evidence that a volunteer program with donated vehicles and grant funding that would not renew forever was not a solution. It was a demonstration of what a solution would need to address. She said, "This is not a story about what a few people built in a closet. It is a story about what the city is not building on every block where people need to get to a doctor and cannot." The young man from the mayor's office stopped writing. One of the senior staff said that the city had NEMT programs for Medicaid recipients. I'm like, Imani said she knew. She said 60% of the patients Route Home served either did not qualify for NEMT or faced documentation barriers that made accessing it practically impossible. She had the breakdown by clinic, by patient category, by appointment type. After the presentation in the hallway, Reeves stood next to Imani and said quietly that 3 of the 11 people in that room were going to remember what they heard today in a way that would matter in 6 months. Imani said she hoped so. Reeves said, "I do not deal in hope at this stage. I deal in probability. 3 of 11 is a good probability for a first meeting." It did. 6 months later, the city included a pilot transportation access program for health appointments in a budget proposal. The pilot was not Route Home. It was something larger, something with city infrastructure in a dedicated budget line. It was not yet running. It was a proposal. It would take another 8 months to become an operational program. Imani knew this. She had known since the night she corrected the budget number at 2:47 in the morning that the path from a storage closet to a city policy was going to be longer than anyone hoped and shorter than anyone feared, which is the pace at which all important things move when the people building them refuse to stop. She told Cedric about the pilot proposal on a Friday afternoon in the dispatch room after the routes were done and Devin was finishing the mileage log and Zora was asleep in the carrier on Imani's chest. Cedric listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is good." She said that was all he had to say. He said the pilot would serve people who were not being served now. He said that was the whole point. He said the whole point had always been the people, not the program. She looked at him. He said the program is a container. The people are what matters. If the city builds a bigger container, that is what we wanted. She said, "You know it is going to take years." He said he knew. He said it had already taken years. He said years was the unit of measure for things that actually changed. Devin looked up from the mileage log. He said he had written down what Cedric just said because he thought he was going to need it someday. Cedric said he could have it. Devin wrote it in the margin of the log. In the depot break room on 77th Street, Gerald Pitts watched the 5 o'clock news segment about the program. He watched it with a cup of coffee in his hand and the expression of a man watching something he cannot locate himself inside of. He watched Cedric explain what the program was for. He watched Imani describe the patients who missed appointments and why. He finished his coffee. He stood up. He rinsed the mug in the sink. He went out to his bus. The seat beside the driver's seat was empty. It had always been empty. He pulled out of the lot. Some people hear a story about something they could have done and they turn the page. It is not cruelty that makes them do this. It is the necessity of continuing to live inside the version of themselves they have already built. Judgment is too simple for what Gerald was. He was a man who had made the only choice available to the person he was on that particular evening and who would go on being that person driving that route running on time. That is also a story, just not this one. The dispatch room, 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The day's routes were done. The board was cleared. Cedric was at the desk going through the week's mileage logs when Imani came in from the clinic side still in her scrubs, Zora on her hip. Zora was 2. She looked at things with the particular gravity of a child who had decided that the world was worth paying attention to. She looked at the board. She looked at the phone. She looked at the jacket on the wall. She pointed at it. She said, "Coat." Imani looked at the jacket. She looked at Cedric. He looked at Zora. He said, "Yes." He said that was a coat. Zora continued to look at it with the focused consideration of someone who has correctly identified something and is now deciding what it means. Imani set her down and let her walk to the wall, which she did in the slightly effortful way that 2-year-olds walk when they are moving with intention, and she reached up and touched the bottom hem of the jacket with both hands, which was as high as she could reach. She held the fabric between her fingers. She looked up at it. Then she looked at her mother. She looked at Cedric. She looked back at the jacket. She did not say anything else. She had said the word for it. That was sufficient. Imani looked at the jacket hanging there with Zora's hands on the hem. She thought about what the jacket had held. Not metaphorically, actually. It had held the cold of a February night. It had held the warmth it gave to someone standing in the snow. It had held the smell of a bus for 4 months while a woman wore it every day and kept it close. It had held the weight of a pregnancy and a set of clinic results and a photograph in its left pocket, and a child who was now standing beneath it with her hands on its hem. It had traveled from a seat on a bus to a wall in a room, and along the way it had been everything it was possible for a jacket to be, which was not much in material terms and everything in human ones. Imani picked Zora up. She held her on her hip. She looked at Cedric. She said, "I am going to tell her the whole story someday." He said he knew. She said from the beginning. He said that was the only way. She looked at the jacket one more time. Then she turned toward the door. He said her name. She turned back. He said, "You know the part of the story that she will care about most." She looked at him. He said the part where you kept going after Terrence left and the hospital closed and the card was 75 cents short and the door closed. The part where you kept going anyway. He said that was the part that mattered. He said that was the part worth knowing. Imani stood in the doorway with Zora on her hip, and the afternoon light coming through the window of the dispatch room at the particular low angle of November, landing on the whiteboard, and the phone and the jacket on the wall, and the two of them standing at either end of a room that they had built from a storage closet, and a $1.99 hook in a chain of decisions made by people who had not walked past. She said, "I will make sure she knows that part." She went home. Cedric sat at the desk. The room was quiet. Outside, the south side of Chicago was doing what it always did, which was continue. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the phone. He looked at the jacket. He thought about Dorothy Mills, not as an emblem or a lesson, but as a person, a woman who had lived on 43rd Street and driven a car and done the ordinary, extraordinary thing of not driving past a child in the snow. A woman who had gone home afterward and got on with her life, not knowing that she had started something, not needing to know, having simply done the thing that was in front of her to do. He thought about what it meant that she had never known. He thought about the 47 patients in the first month, and Harold at the VA, and Devin at Kennedy King and Mrs. Gibbon in her blue coat, and Carolyn's Honda with the card under the wiper, and the 412 names on the shelter petition, and the 19% in the case that Imani was building for the city, and all the things that would come after the case. Some things start before you know they have started. Some things become larger than the moment that made them. Some things travel further than the hands that first held them, and they do this not because of anything grand in their nature, but because the people who encountered them made the choice each time a choice was available to carry them forward rather than set them down. Cedric stood up from the desk. He put on his coat. He turned off the light. He went to the door. He looked back at the room once at the whiteboard and the phone and the bulletin board with Mrs. Gibbons' photograph and Carolyn's card, and the route schedule for Wednesday, and Devin's notes pinned to the lower corner. He looked at the jacket on the wall. He turned off the light. The jacket was still there in the dark. It would be there in the morning. He went home. 3 miles north, Imani was giving Zora a bath. Zora sat in the water with the focused pleasure of a person who has discovered that warm water and rubber ducks represent a significant percentage of what makes life worthwhile. Imani sat on the edge of the tub and watched her and thought about what Cedric had said. The part where you kept going. She thought about the specific moments that had required keeping going. Not the big ones, not February 14th, or the committee room or the grant letter, but the small ones that had accumulated between and around those larger moments. The Tuesday in July, when the insurance paperwork arrived with an error that required 3 weeks to resolve. The morning in August, when 2 drivers called out on the same day and she had driven 2 routes herself before her shift at the clinic. The afternoon, Devin had called to say he was thinking about withdrawing from the placement exam because he was not sure he could handle failing again. She had said to him something she had not planned to say, something that had come from a place she had not known was available to her. She had said the failing is already done. It already happened and it is finished. The only question now is what you do with the morning of the test. Devon had been quiet on the line. Then he had said okay, he had passed the exam. She looked at Zora in the water. She thought about what it meant to raise someone in the specific knowledge that the world does not always stop for you, but that sometimes when the right person is paying attention, it does. And that being the right person was a choice available to anyone willing to make it. Zora looked up at her. She said, Mama. Imani said yes. Zora pointed at the rubber duck. She said duck. Imani said that was right. She said it was a duck. Zora held it out to Imani. Imani took it. Zora looked at her. She looked at the duck in Imani's hands. She looked back at Imani. Then she held out her hands and Imani gave it back. There was a morning in late November, 2 weeks after Lorraine's visit, when the first real snow of the season came down in the specific way that first snows come down in Chicago, which is without warning and with complete commitment, as if the sky had been holding it back all autumn and had finally decided there was no reason to wait any longer. Cedric was driving the 7 o'clock run when it started. He had Mrs. Given in the back seat and was 3 blocks from the dialysis center when the snow began, first a few flakes against the windshield and then more, and then the particular density that requires the wipers to work on their highest setting and still only keeps up. Mrs. Given watched the snow through the window. She said she had not seen it come down like this since the winter of 2011. Cedric said that had been a bad one. She said she remembered. She said she had been stuck in her apartment for 4 days and her daughter in Atlanta had called every morning and offered twice to fly up, and each time Mrs. Given had said no. She said she had not needed flying up. She had needed the roads to clear. Cedric pulled up to the dialysis center entrance. He got out and went around and opened the door and walked beside her to the entrance in case the pavement was slick. She went in. He went back to the car. He sat in the parking lot for a moment after she was inside. The snow was coming down steadily now. He looked at the entrance through the windshield. He thought about what the dialysis center was and what it represented, which was a place that Mrs. Given's kidneys required her to visit 3 times a week in order for her body to continue doing the things bodies need to do. He thought about the 3 times a week for however many years it had been and however many years remained, and about the specific weight of a schedule that could not be rearranged or abbreviated or skipped. He thought about Mrs. Given managing that schedule for 2 years before route home, which was by depending on a bus that arrived sometimes and did not arrive other times, and that had on the specific occasions when it did not arrive, meant that a 68-year-old woman with end-stage kidney disease had stood at a pole in whatever the weather was doing and waited and sometimes made it and sometimes did not. He drove back to the clinic. He picked up Harold's address and drove to Harold's building. Harold was already downstairs, standing just inside the entrance door where it was dry, watching for the car. When he saw it pull up, he came out and got in and said, "It is really coming down." Cedric said it was. Harold said, "You know what? I thought this morning when I woke up and saw the snow." Cedric said he did not. Harold said, "I thought the car is still coming." He said he had not thought about that before this morning, not in that way, not consciously. He said for 2 years before route home, every time it snowed, he had run the calculation in his head about whether to try to make it to the VA or whether the weather made the attempt not worth the monton. He said the cost was not just physical, though it was physical. It was the cost of preparing yourself to go somewhere and arriving at a version of the journey that was harder than expected, and then arriving at the destination already depleted, already behind, already in debt to the effort of having gotten there. He said, "This morning I woke up and I saw the snow and I thought the car is still coming. And then I got ready to go." Cedric drove through the snow toward the VA. Harold looked out the window at the city in the early morning white. He said, "That does not sound like much when I say it." Cedric said it sounded like everything to him. Harold was quiet. They drove through the snow. The city was quieter than usual under the early accumulation, the way cities get quiet when something has covered the ordinary surfaces with something unfamiliar, and people are still adjusting to the version of the world that has arrived overnight. The VA was ahead. Harold went in. Cedric waited. The snow kept coming down. The car was still there. This is not a story about a hero. Heroes are singular and their acts are finished when the story ends. This is a story about a chain, which is a different thing because a chain does not end with any single link. It continues for as long as the next link is made. The next link is always being made somewhere by someone who looked at a gap and decided it was theirs to fill, who looked at a door and decided to hold it, who looked at a jacket on a seat and understood without being told that there was a reason it was there and that the reason was now. Dorothy Mills stopped her car in 1996. Lorraine Holloway said a sentence for 34 years until it became the floor of a house. Cedric Holloway folded a jacket on a seat every morning for 6 years and lost his job for using it. Imani Webb kept going when keeping going was the hardest available option. Otis gave away his car. Devin came downstairs at 8:11. Mrs. Gibbon laughed in a car with a stranger, and it was a real laugh. Harold got back in the car after missing 2 appointments because somebody came to the door instead of canceling the ride. Walter Hines remembered what it felt like to need to get somewhere and not be able to and charge 40% less. Reeves signed a letter and made 2 calls and said I was wrong without softening the edges of it. Carolyn Marsh washed her Honda and put in a full tank and tucked a card under the wiper that said, "Use it well." The man in the blue vest at the neighborhood meeting wrote his wife's name and the day of her appointment and trusted that it would matter. None of them fixed everything. None of them were supposed to. Each of them did the thing that was in front of them to do, and the things connected. And the connection became something that none of them could have built alone, which is the only way things worth building ever get built. You have been on buses like the ones in this story. You have sat in waiting rooms. You have stood at stops without shelters. You have been the person the door closed on, and you have been the person who watched it close, and you have been the person who made the decision about what to do with the next moment. The next moment is always coming. There is always someone standing in the cold. There is always a jacket, and it belongs to whoever is closest. You do not have to fix everything. You just have to not walk past.